Uh, Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy that I can participate in this workshop. The title of my presentation, Poetic Image and Logos, Late Nishitani and Late Heidegger. I read this paper, introduction. In this presentation, I would like to deal with the problem of image keisho in Nishitani Keiji in relation to Heidegger. In context of the theme of this symposium, Japanese philosophy, I will consider Nishitani with the aim of examining the philosophy of form, katachi, in Nishida, or more precisely, the form of the formless, katachi naki mono no katachi, or the formless form, katachi naki katachi, of the philosophy of the Kyoto school, in a triangle with Nishida at the top, and Nishitani and Miki at the bottom. In what follows, I would like to approach this problem by locating it in Nishitani's late public paper, Emptiness and Sameness, Kutoso. While this essay draws us into the depth and breadth of Nishitani's mature speculation through his rich insights on various subjects, it also seems to confront us with the fact that there are still various issues to be investigated, as Nishitani himself is said to have stated that he had not completed the work on the title issue. In his masterpiece, Religion and Nothingness, Shūkyō to Ananika, Nishitani examines the concept of emptiness found in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition as a still unexplored philosophical possibility in order to overcome the nihilism of the modern world in confrontation with position of Western philosophy since ancient times, as well as Christian theology and mysticism. There, in discussing the standpoint of emptiness, mentioning Basho and his disciple Hikaku, he refers to the artistic imagination, 芸術的構想力, but refrains from discussing it. However, in this essay, written almost 20 years later, with a fundamental theme of art and religion as a backdrop and beginning with poetry, he delves into the uniqueness of Japanese grammar to elucidate the logos connecting thing and reason, while focusing on the figuration, image of the sky, connected with mood and emotion, and examined the unhindered reason, Jijimuge, and then unhindered things, Jijimuge, in the words of Kegon Buddhism. And lastly, goes to explain the characteristics of range of the elemental imagination, 根源的構想力. In what follows, I would like to note that this essay begins with emptiness in poetry and discuss poetic image and emptiness. In this process, I will try to compare the standpoint of Nishitani with Heidegger's, especially with that of the late Heidegger. The reason for this comparison is that Nishitani always spontaneously incorporates Heidegger's terminology when he develops his own thinking. And the reason I choose the latter Heidegger in particular is that he also shows deepening of thinking in the post-war period that is comparable to Nishitani. The expression, the word was, die Welt wertet, is frequently used in Religion and Nothingness. In Nishitani's terminology, we find not only a borrowing from Heidegger, but also a reductive use of the terminology, which is required by the matter of thinking. Our theme of poetic image and logos is precisely a setting to explore the similarities between the two, as well as their decisive differences based on the phenomenon of the world. Such an attempt may present one of the possibilities that Heidegger later saw as inevitable dialogue with East Asian thought. Chapter 1. Emptiness in image and logos in poetry. First, let's follow the development of Nishitani's thinking. Nishitani, who begins his discussion with emptiness in poetry as mentioned above, confirms that this term is one that is encountered in the realm of theoretical investigation of this doctrine, but is rather a word that is widely and commonly used. In Chinese translations of Buddhist texts, for example, emptiness is the sky one sees, and the emptiness that became visible was used in the sutras to describe an image built to indicate eternally unlimited things that cannot be seen with the eye. The word image is a visible image without form, since the visible void is formless. It should be noted that the visualization of the formless is echoed in the word emptiness and in anticipation. We can already recognize here a clue that we will later use to compare our position with Heidegger's. Nishitani further notes that the word emptiness came to describe a Buddhist-like feeling that appeared in Chinese and Japanese art, especially in painting and poetry. To further confirm the form in which emptiness as a Buddhist doctrine has permeated the sensory world, or the sensory and emotional emptiness, the next clue is Haikai of Basho. It is clear from several essays on Basho that he had a special meaning for Nishitani and his interpretation of Basho, which is strongly linked to his interpretation on Zen Buddhism. Is extremely rich in suggestions. However, although he refers to an example from Basho, he does not cite Basho's haiku itself, and in fact, the main consideration is directed to a haiku by his disciple, Naito Joso, the bottom of loneliness, force of all, the falling free, 寂しさの底抜けて降るみぞれかな。According to Nishitani, the problem lies in the fact that haiku is a form of poetry, and language remains as a root of the problem. The area unique to poetry is the image, form, and mental picture that words bring about. What is found there is nothing other than the grammar recognized in the formation of poetry, as opposed to the position of Western logic, or a grammar organized by reflecting the reason contained in words to the position of intellect and reason. The problem is that, in contrast to traditional logic, which is based on pure reason, it goes back to a more pristine place from which a traditional logic based on pure reason came. Nishitani says, by pristine place, I mean at the same time the place in actual experience as well as in history. In both instances, the problem is related not only to the fact that words become poetry, but also to formation of poetry, to the process of poetic composition. It is also clear that this double pristine place corresponds to Heidegger's word Anfang. The pristine place in actual experience is what is originally given, in which the fact is directly given. For example, in the instance that the voice of the skater is heard, in the place where voice equals hearing, comes into being without I, what is heard in the scalar's voice in the image of scale. When something is sensed, not only in hearing, but in all the senses, the pristine germinative image which produces these senses is included. It is a mental image that is a result of the power of image formation included in the strength of passive sensation, the passive faculty, like an embryo within the germ of a seed. In this way, poetry comes into being at a place where reality is original, taking precedence over reflection. An actual place where reality is experienced as a thing in itself. According to Nishitani, if language is the expression of reality, then the place in question where reality reveals itself in the original form of the thing must be place where language reveals its pristine form. What is established there is called a law appearing in the thread of a bun, that is different from the so-called grammar or law of the text, bunpo. By the way, the place where an original fact appears as fact is the place where image, which is one with the fact, appears uniquely as itself. On the other hand, when the originality of the thing is regarded as overlapping with the originality of language, the very root of the language is inseparable from the function of image. In other words, the generation of language is one with the generation of image to which it refers, and the thing has already been transferred to the world. In this way, when a fact is accepted as fact with the formation of words, the image that works like an embryo in sense in the thing reveals itself. This is where the essence of language is fundamentally found in poetry. What Nishitani thought, based on the words of the poem, is the reason that makes the thing possible within the thing, where the reason composing original facts and the reason working in thought become one, and the thing and the reason are in perfect accord, is unhindered reason, Riji Muge. The composition of poetry investigates the pristine reality, keeping itself free from the obstacles of rationality as much as possible. As long as poetry is a language art, there is a function of what should be called logos, as in the logos of language and the logos of unhindered reason. From there, Nishitani, however, together with the question of how far can we go to exhaust our investigation of original process of poetry making, heads toward a place where reason disappears. That is where reason is absorbed into thing, and thing shows itself as thing alone. In short, it is a thoroughgoing chain from unhindered reason to unhindered things. Jijimuge kara jijimuge. According to Nishitani, this is where art reaches its limit and religion is established beyond it. This is a position of a lack of logic, muri, or no logic, hiri, where no reason is possible. Finally, to answer the question of what image is in such a world of unhindered things, he discusses the elemental imagination. Now that we have confirmed the general development of the argument in emptiness and sameness, we would like to confirm the correspondence with Heidegger's later work based on the above position. Chapter 2, Poetry and Image in the Late Heidegger. Here we understand under the term late Heidegger the period in which the idea of the falling Gefühl presented in his lecture in Bremen in 1949, 4 years after the war, and the relationship between thing and falling, Ding und Gefühl. And in close connection with these two, the rich thoughts on language and poetry, later published in On the Way to Language, developed. In the first section of Emptiness and Sameness, Nishitani explained that emptiness represents the formless, eternal, and infinite sky as a visible void, and that it leads to the void of mind and further cleanliness. Referring to the relationship between emptiness, sky, and dwelling, residing, he states, emptiness is the place where the heart resides, lives and clears itself in purity, separable from the dirty dust of the world. Heidegger, too, in his thought of the falling, listed sky and earth as its components, writing Heideggerian's verse that poetically man dwells, and that under the sky is at the same time on the earth. Earth and sky, divinities and mortals, being at one with one another of their own accord, and belong together by way of simpleness of the united fourfold. Moreover, this appropriating mirror play of the simple one-fold of earth and sky, divinities and mortals, we call the world. The totality of the movement in which the four separated components mutually surrender themselves to each other and work together while maintaining their individuality is described as world was, the Weltbild. On the other hand, when such a world dynamic is reflected in individual thing, the thing sings, das Ding Ding. Against the backdrop of this new world view, man as mortal dwells in the world as foreign, while being familiar with divinities, and as the word poetically indicates, the most important mode of existence is accepted as poetry. The fact that to die is defined as to be capable of death as death, and that death is not immediately the end of existence, but rather the connection of being and nothing, also deepens the thinking of death in the later Heidegger. Furthermore, when Nishitani explains concerning the standpoint of unhindered reason, the connection between the world and a thing A in it, it is said that A obtains a place by being connected with all other things and obtaining a place unique to A, which is the same as Heidegger's argument in his essay, Building Dwelling Thinking. He refers to individual thing, such as a bridge, which gathers four components of the falling and names them things qua location, Dinge als Ort. Moreover, it is important to note that location, place here, is never taken as a kind of space but rather as something that gathers the whole, like the tip of a spear. This is because to gather, versammeln, is nothing other than what Heidegger actively retrieves as the original meaning of logos and its verb form regained after the mid-1930s. With the subsequent development of thought, gathering is superimposed on thing, and thing is spoken of as gathering the whole of falling as word. Here, we can recognize a similarity with Nishitani's frequent use of the word gather to describe the circumstantial relationship, egoteki kankei, of things in religion and nothingness. Heidegger, who had been questioning the logos even before being on time, so the essential mobility of the logos in the gathering that operates between word and thing, and traced it back to the inceptive thinkers, such as Heraclitus and Parmenides. In Heidegger, too, the inceptive, that's unfriendly, is that of history as well as that of things. In other words, he thought the inception of things in the experience which was made in the inception of history. Nishitani, in his discussion of unhindered reason, describes the relationship between the one word and all things as follows. The fact that within their being, all things includes a continually diversifying discrimination comes about only because the word is one, and only within the words a linkage, or the absolute closure in which everything appears in the universe, and the absolute openness in which the word is one, naturally call each other. They become the same thing, and by so doing, they create the linkage of the word. If we apply the structure of the word relation to the form one equal many, many equal one, ichi soku ta, ta soku itsu. One equal mei is the case of seeing all things from the perspective of the word, meaning the one word and the many localities in which that word exists, while many equal one is the case of seeing all things from the perspective of all things, meaning that while all things possesses ultimate individuality, each of them has its own place. It means that all things, while possessing their ultimate individuality, become a place with compartmentalization by acquiring their own place. Thus, the word connection itself is received through the immediate relationship of one and many in the world and all things. On the other hand, the late Heidegger, as mentioned above, not only associates the tautological wording and thinking with word and thing, but also interchangeably combine the two words in various ways, such as wording thing and thinking word, and describes the dynamic relation between word and thing that is not mutually irreducible. This relationship is also expressed by applying unique terms such as difference, Unterschied, and interest, Ähnlichkeit. Based on the commonalities described above, I would like to add that Heidegger began to use terms such as built and Einbildung in the course of development of these great ideas. As for Heidegger's reference to these terms, as is well known in his earlier Kant und das Problem of Metaphysics. He took the imagination that Kant had analyzed in the first edition of Kritik der reinen Vernunft as the common rule of sensibility and understanding, and tried to ground it in his own subject at this time, transcendence and temporality. However, with Heidegger's own self-criticism of the transcendentalist standpoint, this direction was never developed. On the other hand, in his midterm essay, The Age of the World Picture, he came to regard the situation in which the world becomes the object of representational thinking by modern subjectivity as the world becomes a picture, image. In Heidegger, the term image was received as a position to be overcome in connection with traditional metaphysical thought. For this reason, it is even more noteworthy that in later years, as the idea of falling developed, the term image or imagination came to be used in conjunction with a more active delving into a language and poetry. In particular, in the article Poetical Man Dwelt, which is directly titled after a verse of Heideggerian's, he examined this verse and defines man's dwelling on the earth as measuring the span between sky and earth. According to Heidegger, poetry is a measuring messen or measure taking, nehmen des Maßnahme. For it is a poet who makes it possible to dwell on the earth. Heidegger mentions image in this context. The nature of the image is to let something be seen. In that case, the genuine image lets the invisible be seen, and so imagine the invisible in something aligned to it. According to the sequence of events, it is the poet who draws in the sight of the sky and takes the invisible God in his divinity as invisible God, and thus the poetic image is imagined, einbilden, in a distinctive sense. Here, the relationship among the four components in the following is seen in a unique way. The invisible God, the visible sky, and the poet who receives invisible God on the earth. In other words, the pairing of the invisible and the visible is incorporated in the dynamic relationship between the four. The function of the image is recognized there. In this sense, it may be possible to compare this with Heidegger's position in his later years, when he thought a phenomenology of the inconspicuous, Phänomenologie des Unscheinbaren, in which the invisible, das Unsichtbar, is revealed as something inconspicuous. Although this conception was never fully developed, it is clear that there is an orientation toward showing the invisible through the visible, but only as itself invisible. The activity involved in this situation is poetry. Moreover, in this context, Heidegger states, the poetic saying, Sagen, of images gathers the brightness and sound of the heavenly appearances into one with the darkness and silence of what is alive. The word gather is nothing other than what is taken as the original meaning of logos as described above. The workings of language found in these poetic sayings and the nature of language in poetry are richly explored in the later collection of essays on language, On the Way to Language. There, the phrase, the language speaks, die Sprache spricht, is linked to the word was and the thing thinks. And the essence of Heidegger's later major idea, appropriation, Ereignis, is delved into. As long as the correspondences between phenomenon and logos is consistent in Heidegger's thought, as the phenomenology of being time shows, it is clear that the question of how the movement of language, which is also tautological, relates to the tautological identity of the world and things, will be essential issue in his later thought, especially in On the Way to Language. Clearly, then, the linkage between the movement of language and that of image must also be further explored. In one essay, Language, referring to the relationship between poetry and image, he writes, in the poem Speaking, the poetic imagination, die dichterliche Einbildungskraft, gives itself utterance. It should be additionally noted that Heidegger himself, in another essay, The Way to Language, refers to law, principle, Gesetz, and that appropriation, Ereignis, is that law, principle. In response to what Nishitani calls the logos of language or law in its original sense. Chapter 3, Nishitani and Heidegger again. We have confirmed that Nishitani's later thought resonates in a very essential way with Heidegger's later thoughts. These connections are of great interest in comparing Nishitani's standpoint of emptiness with Heidegger's standpoint of the question of being. However, of course, we do not intend to superimpose thoughts of the both thinkers completely. It is extremely important and at the same time difficult to determine the distinction between the two. But let's consider this in the context of Heidegger's phrase, the word was, which Nishitani repeatedly talks about. When Nishitani found the word of unhindered reason from the standpoint of poetry in emptiness and sameness, the word is the one to the many of all things. And when he further found the word of unhindered things from the standpoint of religion, he understands the word as the ultimate one that does not attract any meaning. On the other hand, in Heidegger too, the word is seen in relation to things in terms of difference and intimacy as described above. But insofar as the word and things are mutually irreducible, it seems possible to superimpose this relationship which Nishitani sees between the one and the many. However, when the world is regarded as a falling, that is, as a dynamic relationship among the four, sky and earth, divinities and modes, and when, at the same time, the simple oneness of the four is named, it is a linkage between the four nature of the falling and the one nature of the simple oneness that makes Heidegger's standpoint original. However, as long as we follow Heidegger's description, we cannot deny the impression that each component of the falling is on the surface, and the oneness concerning of the linkage of these four is receding, it's the background. As long as the falling itself names the four components, it seems to me the oneness of the world that unifies them is not sufficiently delved into as itself. Although we have confirmed that Nishitani finds the ultimate dimension of unhindered things through further thoroughness of the one nature of the unhindered reason, and that this is regarded as a religious dimension that transcended that of an art. On the other hand, it is difficult to find this dimension in Heidegger's thinking. However, this does not mean that the dimension of religiosity cannot be found in Heidegger's position. He sees in the poetry of Heideggerian and further in the poetry of Trakl on the way to language, the divinities in the falling and their variations. Moreover, Heidegger in his later years explores the sacred in the poet's words and finds gratitude, danken, or dank, beyond thinking and poetry, denken und dichten. These things, it seems to me, should be considered as originalities of late Heidegger's thinking. Nishitani, while noting that the elemental imagination stands in the mediatory zone between the senses and the intellect, empirically, the starting point is the intuition or perception of the senses and emphasizes the position of the senses or sensibility as follows. So long as the act of seeing is involved, can't we say that everywhere and all the levels at the beginning was the form? In other words, we exist in the emptiness sensuously and sensitively under the sky. If this is the case, then Nishitani would require something that corresponds to Heidegger's earth, and above all, a body to live directly, sensuously, and perceptually on such an earth. From these perspectives, it is noteworthy that although Nishitani himself did not delve sufficiently into the subject in his published works, from the 1970s until his later years, he actively discussed body in his lectures at Otan University and repeatedly discussed earth in relation to nature and in the Buddhist concept of body earth, Shindo, Buddhist earth, Butsudo, and Buddhist land, Bukkokudo. Since the problem of the body is not treated thematically in Heidegger's persuasive reference to the earth, we may ask where the problem lies. If the problem of the earth and the body can be delved into, the subject of technology, which is a pressing issue in the modern world, can be taken over further. It is well known that Heidegger saw the world of framing, Gestell, as defined by the essence of modern technology, on the other side of the world of the falling. The way of language in this technological world was also insightful as an informational language. Of course, it must be noted that the interconnection between these two worlds and the problem of conversion from one to the other is an issue that is relevant to the modern world and still need to be explored further. What about Nishitani, on the other hand? Nishitani was looking at the 20th century world in which he lived and gaining insight in the modern technology. There must have been some impact from Heidegger's contemporaneous thinking. At the end of this essay, Kutosoku, he also insightfully states as follows. Even in today's political economic world, several political and economic doctrines support as ideologies the structure of the nation and international relationships, hardening people's passions and intellect into beliefs, and causing anxieties and crises throughout the entire world. We cannot deny that at the root of this situation lurks the motion of the imagination, including fancy and fantasy, in the shape of evil. Nishitani truly himself declares that I should be more detailed on the foregoing points, but because this is so, it must be said that these are precisely the issue left to be addressed after Nishitani. Although there may be many more subjects between Nishitani and Heidegger, I would like to take it. Thanks.
Perhaps I think an open to discussion, at least 15 minutes for sure. We can. The people on Zoom, if they want to pose a question or make a comment, please switch your microphone on and enter in the discussion freely. So, if anyone here in the room who wants to open the discussion.
Yeah. Okay, I recognize. You recognize it. I'm glad. Yeah, I have just maybe a small question for clarification. I think it was interesting, this movement of language and movement of images, and how those can either have some kind of relationship to each other. And for example, Nishitani in poetic composition, and also it seems, as you showed, in Heidegger as well. And the point I want to ask you about, this movement of images and movement of language, do you understand this within a kind of a historical perspective, or should we understand this more narrowly as maybe maybe an anthropological movement? Right? Is this, should we understand this movement as something in history or something in kind of individual human beings?
Historically, your question is about the relationship between image and language, or movement of language and movement of but in which sense do you use the word historic?
So the word move, when we say
Historical movement.
is, yeah, should we understand it as historical movement, or kind of yeah, some other kind of no.
That was planned. Also, was going to ask something.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess I want to understand this kind of, if we say ugoki or undo, or is it from a historical moving? It kind of,
I don't know. I can understand the meaning of your question, but so far as I can answer, for example, in Heidegger's case, in his history of being, so in this thinking, the point of history in Heidegger's thought have a peak, but in later Heidegger, in later period, Heidegger interprets as I show today, the thinking of language and image becomes stronger. But in this period, so far as I think, the problem of history, it goes back or something disappears. So the problem of relationship between history and the other side, language or poetry, image, this relationship is very problem. So I understand. So far as I can say, Nishitani sees the place of connections between language and image. This place is is that from which history generates or this is of course not the meaning of historicity in the general sense.
Okay. Maybe as a follow-up, but first, thank you very much for a very insightful text. If I understand correctly, then Heidegger as well as Nishitani are thinking about art as something which discloses some very primordial dimension, right? We usually do not reach by reason, logos, and so on. This I understand very well. And art being one of those dimensions where this truth, to speak with Heidegger, is disclosed. Okay, now to the question about history. We know that art has some history, right? And I wonder whether Heidegger or Nishitani, maybe both of them, would think that there are artworks, language art, but you also can talk about visual art, paintings, architecture, sculptures, all those things also are works of art, right? And Heidegger himself uses this image of a Greek temple to describe how a world comes into being, right? So I wonder whether there are grades of, what do you say, of this closing this primordial dimension. So would you say that in the history of art, there is a development, for instance, that in the beginning, this dimension was just disclosed in a very exceptional way, but when it goes on, it becomes more dim and in the end. So like Heidegger's view on the history of being, which in the very beginning was still able to be experienced, but growing on through Christianity, the early modern thought, modernity, and then to take technology, we are no longer in the position to experience this being with capital B, right? So is there something similar in art, that there are artworks that are more suitable to disclose this primordial dimension? Or what are these standards by which we measure? So this is an exceptional artwork. This artwork discloses this primordial dimension better than the other one. So I know
Better than?
better than another artwork.
Better than another work?
Yeah, better than another. So maybe Heideggerian is much more superior than Heideggerian is much more superior than, for instance, Günter Grass or Thomas Mann, something like that.
Better than another work.
Yeah,
Another one.
another
Work of art.
another work of art. So Heidegger has his poets, right? Nake, Heideggerian, these guys. And there are a whole bunch of other poets out there, but they are not mentioned. I just wonder why. Why are they not mentioned? So what is about their language that is insufficient or not so superior than the language of Hölderlin? And I think that has to do with history, maybe.
Thank you very much for your questions. It is not clear whether I can understand your questions, but your question is a question about artwork. About work is very useful in thinking about the question of Soba-san. And so in the case of Heidegger, he emphasized the artwork of poetry of Heideggerian and Tracker and so forth. But there is, as you say, primordial dimension in that only great artworks disclose it. So in standpoint of Heidegger and in stand of Nishitani, they see that the dimension or a historical dimension which only artworks can produce. But, sorry, I can't answer your question.
But maybe there are other ones.
We have time for a last question or comment, or also from the people on Zoom. If you want to enter in the discussion, switch your microphone on and put your questions.
すいません。一つ質問したいんですけれども、should I ask in English maybe?
Or in Japanese or both?
Only German.
Das kann ich auch.
Ja, uns einig.
Am besten.
西谷とハイデガーのちょっと違いについて考えたいんですけれども、最後のところでおっしゃってる身体性ですね。結構それ違うところだと私は思うんですけれども、I just said that I'm thinking through the differences between Heidegger and Nishitani, and what seems to me to be a striking difference is what Professor Akitomi mentioned at the end regarding embodiment, the role of the body. And it seems for Heidegger's Gestell, the Heidegger's technology, lacks this dimension of the subject, that we are the subject of making technology, like in Nishida or Miki. Somehow the technology is alienated, it inframes us. Whereas it seems to me for most of the Kyoto school thinkers, the technology is not so much an alienated inframing, but something that we can do, right, in history. So I wonder what you think of this difference at the end that you mentioned. I mean, you mentioned that you're going to think through this. So I wonder if you thought through this a little bit. Maybe not. It's okay. じゃないですか。どう思うか。どうでしょう。
身体。
っていうか、なんかほら、ハイデガーだと、テクノロジーがなんかこう、私たちを捉えるみたいな言い方して、私たちがなんか主体性が出てこないじゃないですか、テクノロジーに関する。だけど、西田にしろ、三木にしろ、多分西谷にしろ、テクノロジーを考えるときに、主体性がもうちょっと出てくると思うんですね。私たちがテクノロジーを想像力によって作るっていうんですけど、そういうふうにテクノロジーの、がある場所がもうちょっと私たちに近いように思うんですけど、ハイデガーに比べると。で、それでなんでかっていうと、私はそれは身体性とか、歴史の中に身体性がハイデガーは入っていないからと思うんです。だからなんかテクノロジーがなんとなくこう、レイファイズっていうんですか、こう、対象化されちゃって、なんか私たちのところに来るみたいな書き方に読めるんですけど、その違いって私はすごく違うと思うんですけど、いかがでしょう。
まず、技術、テクノロジーの問題を考えるときに、西田美紀と西谷ではやっぱり
かなり違
いますよ。で、まず時代が違いますから、技術っていうことで見ている現象が違う。で、これはもう決定的だと思うんです。特に20世紀に戦後を経験した西谷と経験してない西田美紀では。だからもちろん西田美紀が時代的に制約されているというふうには思いません、僕は。むしろいろんな可能性が取り出せると思うんですけども、仮に、三者を一つにして身体性な時にハイデガーとどう違うかっていう。
ハイデガー自体にほら身体性がかなり出てこないので、でテクノロジーっていう時はテーマになるのは私たちがものを作るっていうことがテーマになるじゃないですか。だからそういう違いかなと思ったりもします。
そうですね。やっぱ作るっていう観点。これがさっきの、ビダバハさんも言われたけども、そうですね。ハイデガーの場合は作るっていうのはやっぱ芸術。
そう芸術で例えばハンマーのなんていうのフォーハンドハイとかそういうのには出てきたんですけど、それからなんかテクノロジーがなんかこうなんていうんですかね、私たちから離れてしまっていったっていうんですか。まあでもいいです。答えが出る問題でもないんで。
いや、だけどそこは。
So thank you very much, Professor Akitomi, for your presentation.